welcome to this GCSE Ready Project B. This project will focus on Edward Jenner, John Snow and the fight against infectious disease in the 18th and 19th century, which is an important part of the Medicine Through Time module, which is one of the modules that you do during your GCSE. You will need the lesson notes booklet that goes with this lesson. You will find that on class charts. It will have been emailed to you, and failing all of that, you can find it, a Google Documents link to it, in the description at the bottom of this video. We are going to focus first of all on something that's very current, and we're going to have a look at the current coronavirus pandemic and think about the way in which our understanding of how disease spreads shapes our response to it, and then we're going to contrast that with people's understanding of how disease spread and the problems associated with that in the 18th and the 19th century. So, first of all, watch this little clip that talks about exactly what coronavirus is and how it spreads, most of which we probably already know because we've been told a lot about it recently, but here we go anyway.
Coronaviruses are a type of virus. The one we're all talking about is new, and it causes a disease called COVID-19. Now, most people will only be mildly affected by it, but it can kill. It starts by infecting our upper respiratory tracts, which are the airways from your nose to just above your vocal cords. You may develop a fever as your immune system starts to fight the virus, and a dry cough. That's one where you don't produce any phlegm. The virus can then spread to the lungs, making it harder for people to breathe, and it can cause pneumonia. In the most serious cases, people can die from the coronavirus. This is because the immune system can go into overdrive, and that can lead to organ failure. So we need to do what we can to stop this virus from spreading. As it gets into your body by breathing it in or through your eyes and mouth, the best thing to do is wash your hands regularly and properly.
Right, that's information we've probably heard a lot about recently, but it shows our understanding of how the virus is spread, how people contract the disease, and what it does to them. That was not the case with people's understanding of what caused disease and what caused people to be ill in the 18th and 19th century, for much of the 19th century, that is. What you want to do now is look at task 1. So you're going to read the information, and then once you've read the information, you're going to answer the question underneath. What problems would there be with the spread of disease and these ideas about its cause? So what problems is there going to be as a result of this lack of understanding with how disease spread and with ideas about its cause? Okay, so what we can see here, the important thing here, what we're talking about when we say what problems would there be with the spread of disease with these ideas about its cause, people didn't understand what caused disease. People didn't understand how that disease was transmitted from one person to another. So we have in the current coronavirus pandemic, we have social distancing measures, we have information about washing our hands, etc., etc. They did not understand bacteria, virus, disease in that way. They had different ideas. Miasma, the idea that there was bad air that was filled with poisonous fumes, or spontaneous generation, that somehow disease was caused by germs that were produced by flesh and vegetables as they rotted. Okay, so we can see that there will be problems in the 18th and 19th century and before because people didn't understand how viruses and how diseases spread. It seems that some people in the current pandemic are still unsure about how best to advise people to treat a particular disease, in this case coronavirus. Have a look at this clip here.
Now, President Trump has been lambasted by the medical community after suggesting research into whether coronavirus might be treated by injecting disinfectant into the human body. He also appeared to propose irradiating patients' bodies with UV light, an idea dismissed by a doctor at the briefing. Another of his officials had moments earlier said sunlight and disinfectant were known to kill the infection. Mr. Trump's own public health agencies warn against bleach as a medicine. This is what the US president said.
So, supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number on the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. So we'll see. But the whole concept of the light, the way it kills it in 1 minute, that's pretty powerful.
Well, doctors were quick to warn that the president's idea could have fatal results. And responding to Donald Trump at the briefing, Dr. Deborah Birx, the White House coronavirus response coordinator, seemed taken aback at his suggestion.
Deborah, have you ever heard of that, the heat and the light relative to certain viruses? Yes, but relative to this virus?
Not as a treatment. I mean, certainly fever
Yeah.
is a good thing when you have a fever. It helps your body respond. But not as, I've not seen heat or light.
I think it's a great thing to look at. I mean, you know, okay.
So, understandably, the medical community was shocked and horrified that Trump was suggesting some sort of treatment where you inject yourself with disinfectant or you somehow try to get some ultraviolet light inside your body. And it shows the danger of people coming up with treatments and ideas for how to deal with a disease or a virus that are actually going to do you more harm than the virus itself. So it helps us to understand, I guess, that clip and people's reaction to it. The problems in the 18th and 19th century when people didn't actually know the cause of a disease or a virus and were trying treatments, were trying to deal with it in a way that didn't actually work. What we're going to do now is we're going to move on to have a look at two individuals, Edward Jenner and John Snow, who made a big contribution in the late 18th into the 19th century in trying to help stop infectious disease and try to help understand why infectious diseases spread and how they spread. And so we're going to first look at Edward Jenner, and this is going to take you to task 2 in your lesson notes booklet. Okay, so you'll see on task 2 that there is some information about Edward Jenner, and then there are 4 questions underneath. What I want you to do in a moment is you are going to pause this clip. You are going to read the information about Edward Jenner, and then you're going to answer the 4 questions underneath. So pause this now and get on with task 2. Right, welcome back. We will look at the answers in a moment. Just to help you further, in case there's any answers that you didn't get, then have a look at this little clip, which might give you some clues in case you missed any of the information to help you answer the questions.
Dr. Jenner was an expert on cuckoos. He was also a good scientist because he asked the right questions. What he really wanted was to conquer the deadly smallpox. Cows sometimes caught cowpox, and milkmaids often caught cowpox from the cows. Cowpox didn't do the milkmaids much harm. What interested Jenner was that they never seemed to catch the deadly smallpox. Thousands used to die from smallpox. Why not milkmaids? Could it be that cowpox got in the way? Could catching cowpox stop them catching smallpox? To test his theory, he needed someone young who hadn't had either cowpox or smallpox. He chose James Phipps, aged 8 3/4. He told the lad he thought he could stop him from ever catching smallpox and that it wouldn't hurt much. Then he took some pus from Sarah's cowpox and rubbed it into 2 small scratches on the boy's arm. Cowpox was called vaccinia, so Jenner called his invention vaccination. In a few days, James was poorly with cowpox, but he soon got better. 6 weeks later, Jenner took pus from a smallpox victim and deliberately tried to give James Phipps the deadly disease. There was no cure for smallpox. But James didn't get smallpox. He lived to a ripe old age. And now smallpox has been wiped out thanks to Edward Jenner and his vaccination.
Okay, so what we can see there is how important Jenner's discovery was, how crucial it was to the eradication of smallpox. The British government, that last question, we talked about what the British government did to try and stop smallpox. The British government made it compulsory for people to have the smallpox vaccination. Now, that is, for the time of the 19th century, when the government was reluctant to get involved in people's lives and to tell people what to do and to control public health issues, to actually enforce a compulsory vaccination program shows how seriously they took smallpox and shows how seriously they wanted to eradicate it as a disease. And that was because of the fact that smallpox was a terrible killer. And not only was smallpox a terrible killer, but it also left terrible, terrible scars and terrible disfigurement, which had great social impact on people. So Jenner was crucial in helping to defeat smallpox. This little clip here, just coming up, just gives you a sense of how terrible the smallpox disease was.
Smallpox is an ancient deadly disease that has existed for 3,000 years. An estimated 300 million people died from smallpox in the 20th century alone. It was fatal in up to a third of people infected. Early symptoms include high fever and fatigue. This takes between 7 and 17 days after exposure. At this point, the disease becomes contagious. The virus then produces a distinctive rash, particularly on the face, arms and legs. The most infectious period is during the first week of illness. The resulting spots become filled with clear fluid and later pus and then form a crust, which eventually dries up and falls off. The person remains contagious right up until the last scab is removed. The virus spreads through person-to-person contact and saliva droplets in an infected person's breath.
So Jenner's work is in 1796, and the British government makes vaccination compulsory in 1852. It's not until the mid to late 20th century that there is a worldwide vaccination campaign against smallpox. The last recorded case of smallpox was in Somalia in 1977, and then smallpox was declared eradicated by the World Health Organization in 1980. So the long-term impact of Jenner's work is huge. However, what you're going to find as you go throughout this Medicine Through Time course when you start your GCSEs is that the long-term impact of a discovery or some work was often very different to the short-term impact of it. So the first thing we want to consider in task 3, which is where you should be moving on to now, is what we can infer from this image. What can we infer from this cartoon about people's attitudes towards Jenner's discovery in the late 18th and early 19th century? The next part of task 3 asks you to think about what the limitations of Jenner's work were at the time. So you're going to pause this now, you're going to make an inference from this cartoon, and you're going to consider the limitations of Jenner's work, and you're going to jot down your answers in the space provided in task 3. Okay, welcome back. I think what you can infer from this cartoon is that people were resistant to Jenner's ideas. Remember that Jenner's initial discovery of vaccination was by giving some cowpox to people in order to vaccinate them against smallpox. If we see the images here, we have people with bits of cows growing out of them, we have people with cows coming out of their ears and face and noses. People look horrified and frightened as Jenner is performing the vaccination, and so we see that people's attitude in the short term was quite resistant to his method of vaccination, and that people were afraid and skeptical about it. Okay, the second question in task 3 asks you to think about the limits of Jenner's work. Well, the thing about Jenner's work was that it was unique to smallpox. Yes, indeed, cowpox vaccinated people against smallpox, but it didn't work for any other disease. You couldn't give people cowpox to vaccinate them against tuberculosis or diphtheria or anything like that. He couldn't explain why his vaccination technique worked. It just did. He didn't understand antibodies in the way that we do now. He didn't have a microscope or other equipment necessary to discover exactly how and why his vaccination worked. So, in terms of contribution to eventually eradicating smallpox, then Jenner's vaccination is really important. But it's a bit of a dead end for medical progress, in the sense that it doesn't lead to a further understanding of how to produce vaccinations for other diseases. Okay, so we now move on to task 4, and we move on to look at the second of our important individuals in this project, and that is John Snow. Now, John Snow was doing his important work about 50 to 60 years after Edward Jenner. He was doing his work in the 1850s, in the middle of the 19th century. Now, by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, then we start to see the impact of the Industrial Revolution on living conditions, and we see the awful conditions that many people lived, especially the poor people, lived in urban areas. Huge population growth led to lots of problems with sewage, lots of problems with waste, and there was several public health problems as a result. And the first Public Health Act that was passed was not actually passed until 1848. That act was designed to try and improve the conditions in some of the poorer areas to make it more sanitary. However, that act came about because of the work of a guy called Edwin Chadwick, who wrote a report in 1842 about how poor some of these conditions were. However, this Public Health Act in 1848 was not compulsory. It advised people what they could do to improve the situation, but it did not force people in 1848 to do those things. So we have a government advising people to improve conditions, but not actually forcing people to do so, which is why actually the 1852 compulsory smallpox vaccination is such a major event, because the government was not in the habit of forcing people to take public health measures and to take public health advice. What happened with huge population increase was the spread of infectious diseases like cholera. And cholera spread in 1848. It spread in Barnard Castle in 1849. And cholera was a big killer in the 19th century, especially in overcrowded urban areas where it was passed from one person to another with relative ease. Now, John Snow was particularly interested in the spread of cholera and how the disease was passed from one person to another, and this was the major focus of his work in 1854. What you're now going to do in task 4 is read the information about John Snow and try and answer the 2 questions underneath that information. Okay, welcome back. Again, what you should have noted, especially in relation to the second question, is that just like Jenner, people at the time were resistant to Snow's work. So remember with the cartoon we looked at, people's criticism of Jenner at the time, their reluctance to adopt his ideas at first, showed that in the short term, maybe Jenner didn't have as much impact as he had in the long term. John Snow, again, in the short term, people did not necessarily listen to his ideas. So he might have had a big impact in Broad Street, where the pump was removed, but in terms of an overall approach to trying to eradicate the spread of cholera, he was not that influential. Now what you should do is watch this little documentary clip about John Snow, and it might help you to add some more detail to your answers to the 2 questions in task 4.
In 1854, cholera struck the city of London. Over 600 people died in just a few weeks. Physician John Snow is often credited with discovering that cholera is a waterborne disease and with ending the 1854 epidemic by removing the handle from the contaminated Broad Street pump. The full story is much more interesting. So I've been reading about the John Snow pub for years. There it is. Look at that. Right here on what used to be Broad Street is this fine-looking pub. There's this very inauspicious sign that says here, the red granite curbstone over there marks the site of the historic Broad Street pump associated with Dr. John Snow's discovery in 1854 that cholera is conveyed by water. So that's a really simple summary of the whole John Snow story. And to give you just an overview, here's the story. So it's 1854, it's really hot in the end of the summer in London. We're here in Soho, which was a very crowded neighborhood full of tenements with people not of a lot of means, and there were a lot of people crammed into these buildings, you know, many people to an apartment, and it's hot and it's sweaty, and the part that you can't imagine looking right now, because it's still pretty crowded, it's not that hot, but it's still pretty crowded. Here, the street now is completely clean. We see street sweeping vehicles, we see drainage in the streets, we have sewers. None of that was true in 1854. Instead, the people who lived in these buildings, some of them had cesspools in these little front courtyards, and they would take their human waste and other waste and just kind of throw it out the window into the cesspool or bring it down to the cesspool. And then it would drain wherever it drained. And the street, whoa, was not something that you could easily walk on and keep your feet clean. Wow, that's slippery and disgusting. And so people were used to this kind of somewhat disgusting ambiance, and people thought that when there were terrible outbreaks of disease, especially cholera, that it was caused by the very poisonous air, this miasma that they called it. And the smell from all the poo and all the animal waste was pretty horrible, and it was a pretty sensible theory to think that that could be causing disease. But John Snow, who lived not far from here, we'll go there later, was a physician in London who was convinced that cholera in particular was a waterborne disease. It was not carried in this smelly air. And what happened here on this spot in 1854 was that there was a baby who lived at number 40 Broad Street, which would have been just about here, baby Lewis, who came down with some sort of terrible disease that caused really terrible diarrhea. And I think pretty quickly people realized that it was cholera and that there was going to be another outbreak of this very terrible disease. And people started dying. All right, so what happens? What happened was the waste from baby Lewis and other people who became ill with the cholera, so human fecal matter, mixed with the water supply that was in a relatively shallow well, I believe about 20 feet down under the street right here. And then the cholera bacteria began to multiply, and then people would ingest the water, which provides the human intestine the place where the bacteria multiply best. They need a host like that. So anyway, when people ingest this contaminated water, they come down with cholera, from which you die in hours to days. And John Snow, who really was looking for a place where he could, unfortunate circumstances as they were, have a very concentrated outbreak of cholera where he could study the origins of the outbreak, was interested in helping the people, but also interested immediately in collecting information about what was going to happen in this outbreak. So he would have come over here to this neighborhood and started canvassing all the people around here to see who was dying and who needed help and what they had done to possibly ingest water from the various water supplies in the area. And right here, at a location right near this red curbstone, was a source of what was apparently some very clean tasting, sweet tasting actually, water for drinking. Right here is called the Broad Street Pump. And it turned out, as he started canvassing the neighborhood, that he realized that most of the people who had fallen ill and who were continuing to fall ill had drunk water from this particular pump. So there were other water pumps in the neighborhood, and one of the things that we'll see later is that in the end, when he put all his data together and he made a map, he had to show that this pump, by walking, was the closest to almost all of the people who eventually died, 600-something people who died in the epidemic. And so even though there are other pumps that are geographically potentially nearer to those people, this one tasted good and was close to the people who died by walking. So in epidemiology today, it's known that one way to really make your case is to have exceptions to the rule. So people who should have died, who didn't die, and then people who did die for no apparent reason. And so John Snow in his work actually found both of those kinds of exceptions. And so one case is what people sometimes refer to as the people who were saved by the beer. And so these were the brewery workers who worked a few blocks from here and drank mostly beer, and so had a clean supply of things to drink. And the other case was the workhouse that was near here, and these were the most indigent, potentially people in the poorest of health. And so why did they live? They systematically survived this epidemic. And part of the reason, the main and most important reason, is that the workhouse had a well. It had its own source of clean drinking water. So there are the exceptions of people who should have died and didn't die. And then what happened was he also found out about a family who would bring water to a member of that family who had moved far, a couple miles outside of this neighborhood. And they brought her some water, an elderly aunt, and she and her niece drank it. And those people both died. So to us, looking at modern epidemiological methods, John Snow had plenty of evidence to say that this water from this well contained the contaminant that caused the disease. But it still took actually many years until the locals believed his story. And another thing that we should mention is that John Snow did not collect all this data himself. If you look around the street here, you'll see that this is a very busy neighborhood with lots and lots of people, and I think it was even busier in 1854. But it was a small, contained community, and there were people, for example, like the curate, Henry Whitehead, who was a local, who kind of knew everybody. And so John Snow worked with Whitehead and with other people in the area to really canvass the information and collect the kind of sociological, demographic information that he needed to know who lived where, when they died, where they likely got their water, who they talked to, who they came in contact with, all kinds of other details about their personal lives. And so that kind of human data collection in this tightly knit community was also really, really important.
Okay, so you should have got some extra information about John Snow there from that documentary clip. You're now going to turn to task 5, which asks you to really compare who made the biggest contribution to the fight against infectious disease. Was that Edward Jenner or was that John Snow? So think about the information that you've learned about both. Think about the impact that they had both at the time and maybe in the longer term, and then consider who, in your view, had the biggest impact. So pause this and have a go at writing that now. Welcome back. I think there isn't a right and wrong answer to this. So however you have justified your opinion, as long as you can support that opinion with some evidence and you have a rational argument, then that is fine. For my mind, I would probably lean to Edward Jenner as having a longer term impact and as being more significant because of how much a global killer smallpox was, and because he came up with a vaccination against smallpox. Snow, very important in discovering that cholera was a waterborne disease, but that in itself didn't lead to some way of preventing the spread of cholera. He didn't develop a vaccine or a method of prevention in the way that Snow did, the way that Jenner did, sorry, for smallpox. Right, you should be moving now on to task 6, which focuses on the fella in this painting here, Louis Pasteur, and his discovery of germ theory. And what you are looking for when you do the reading and answer the question on task 6 is you're looking for an appreciation of how important Pasteur's breakthrough was in helping to understand why Jenner's discovery was important and why Snow's discovery was important. Jenner's and Snow's discoveries only took them so far because there wasn't a wider understanding of how disease spread, and that wider understanding of how disease spread came from the understanding of germ theory. So pause this, read the information in task 6 and answer the question. Alright, really, Pasteur's breakthrough is crucial in opening our understanding of how disease is spread and what disease is and how we eradicate it. Just think about the idea of washing your hands, about the idea of disinfecting things, about the idea of eradicating bacteria and trying to kill viruses. All of this comes from Pasteur's germ theory, and Pasteur's germ theory is also crucial for Jenner's vaccination, because if we understand that there are certain germs and there are certain viruses that cause a certain disease, then we're able to develop a vaccine to try and prevent people from getting that. If you think about John Snow's discovery, if we know that cholera is spread in the water, and we know what the germ of cholera looks like and how we can see that under a microscope, then that enables us to see how we might eradicate that by treating water, by boiling water, purifying water to stop cholera from spreading. And so germ theory, okay, it's a scientific discovery, so it takes a while. It takes the work of Robert Koch and then Pasteur himself to actually apply that to medicine. It's a scientific discovery first of all, but once it is applied to medicine, then really it opens up our whole understanding of disease, germs, viruses, and how those diseases are transmitted from people to people, and that then leads to our understanding of trying to develop vaccines and treatments for those particular diseases. And so we come to the final task in your lesson notes booklet, this task 7. Look at this question. This is a 16-mark style question from a GCSE Medicine Through Time paper. It says Jenner's discovery of smallpox vaccination was the most important development in ideas about the cause of disease and illness after 1750. How far do you agree? Now, the scope of this answer that you're going to write is only going to focus on the things that you've studied. So we're only going to go about as far as the 1880s, 1890s. You can see one paragraph here that looks at the work of Jenner. However, this question is asking how far his discovery was the most important development in the ideas about the cause of disease and illness after 1750. Think about the work of John Snow and how we might compare Jenner with Snow, but also think about the importance of Pasteur's work. So if we're saying that Jenner's importance is one half of the answer, we need to have a look at the other half of the answer, which might be the work of Snow and Pasteur, and we need some sort of judgment. What we also need at the start of this answer is a line of argument, because this answer just dives straight into Jenner. We don't know what our overall argument is about how important Jenner is in relation to other people's discoveries and breakthroughs that might have been important for the understanding of the cause of disease. So this is the final task that you're going to do. This is a task that the answer that you can submit to your teacher when you've completed it. You're going to look at that. You're effectively going to finish off the answer. It needs a line of argument. It needs the other half of the answer, and it needs a judgment. Everything that you need to be able to do that is in the lesson notes booklet and is in this lesson that you've done to date. So that brings us to the end of this GCSE Ready Project B on Jenner, Snow and the fight against infectious disease. Now, the little clip of music that played at the start of this video lesson and that's going to play towards the end is a piece of music called Local Hero, and I think this is particularly important thinking about the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, and we think about the heroic efforts of medical staff, the heroic efforts of people on the front line, and we should also think of men like Jenner and Snow and Pasteur as heroes also. These people were heroes because of the contribution they made to our understanding of disease and how we could fight infectious disease. So, until next time, take care, bye bye.